Okay, so language sample analysis is a very important part of assessing a child's language. It's also a very functional method to use. However, due to the time requirement that it takes to perform a language analysis, a lot of speech language pathologists don't do this because of their heavy caseload and they just don't have the time to do it. So researchers in the past have investigated whether there is a relative or somewhat similar relationship or an absolute or exact reliability between the language productivity and the complexity measures between longer and short language samples. However, the problem with these studies is that they didn't have very many participants, and they took a short language sample from a larger one, and so it wasn't very accurate or reliable. And it only had relative reliability, and they used conversational samples instead of like a story to get a complex language sample. And so brief narrative language samples have the potential to also contain all the necessary microstructure features of language, including language complexity and productivity. And so we were trying to see with our study if we can use short language narratives which take a lot less time, but they still have valid results. And so we were trying to see if we could get absolute or relative reliability with long and versus short narratives with school-age children.
Yeah, so just to make it totally clear, the research questions we have on our poster say, are language complexity and language productivity measures of short narrative retells from school-age children significantly correlated with those obtained from a long-term narrative retell, or are they statistically different from those obtained from a long-term narrative retell? So in order to test this, we worked with 193 children from kindergarten to 6th grade from 4 mountain states. And from there, we administered 2 NLMs and a FWE story. An NLM is a short narrative that took approximately 30 minutes or 30 seconds to tell. And once we told that story to the child, they were asked to retell it. And then when we administered the Frog, Where Are You?, the FWE, that was when we were able to hand a child a picture book that doesn't have any words, and it's just a story about a boy and his frog and the adventures that they take. So as we had each of these kids retell both of these stories, we were able to go ahead and start scoring their language complexity. So as you can see on the screen, we have a flow chart here that talks about, or that assesses language complexity. So if you look at all those different categories, some of them have to do with dialogue, or just kind of to show the complexity and kind of how well that they can tell the story. So we would go through and mark all of those, and then we could also run their transcript through the SALT database, so we could get a better screening for how long their sentences were, how many words they were using, and we could get kind of more of an analytical data.
Perfect. So using those flowcharts and the information that we pulled from SALT, we were able to gather some results. So we first looked at the relative reliability. So how similar were the results between the long story, the FWE, and the shorter NLM stories? And overall, we found moderate to moderately strong correlations. So this first graph here, we looked at words per minute, and we had a pretty strong correlation there between the FWE and the NLM, showing that relatively they were scoring pretty similarly. Next, we looked at the subordination index, which is a measure of language complexity. And this one had a moderate correlation. So we were still kind of seeing those relative similar scores between the FWE and the NLM. After that, we looked at the MLU, the mean length of utterance, how long the utterances of these children were. And once again, we had a moderate correlation between the FWE and the NLM. So they were scoring about in those same ranges, more or less. And finally, we looked at the moving average type token ratio, or the number of different words. And this was the only section where we did not see any correlation between the two. After that, we went on to look at the absolute reliability, or whether or not these two methods of assessment were giving us the exact same scores. And overall, we saw some significant results. As far as language complexity, which this first measure is looking at that flow chart that we described earlier, we saw that the FWE had a significantly higher score for language complexity. And we think that's for a couple different reasons that we'll discuss later on. For MLU, we did not see a significant difference or core. There was no significance in that difference. Subordination index, type token ratio, and words per minute, the NLM had scored significantly higher in those areas. And we were able to see that absolute reliability between the two.
Great. So what can we do now? Well, originally we thought the FWE should be a gold standard to which the NLM can be held because of its length. But like Melanie was saying, we found that in a lot of ways, the NLM showed statistically significant results that were greater than the FWE with the subordination index, the number of different words, and the words per minute. As Melanie said, the language complexity in the FWE, the mean was larger, but we think that's because the FWE is a longer story, so the kids have more opportunities to produce complex language. Next time, we think we want to look at these more as a ratio, given how many opportunities were the children given and how many did they take to produce complex language. So although there were significant differences between the short and long narratives, future research should examine whether those differences are clinically meaningful. And while this study focused on differences in length and narratives, there were other differences in the stories that should be controlled for in future studies, like using pictures or not using pictures. So that was our study.